So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Coming to you today from Ljubljana in Slovenia, a gorgeous city if you have a chance to visit. We are nearing the end of reading The Human Condition by Hannah Arendt. And I think we have one more week, or maybe two. I'll have to look. Maybe someone can look and put it in the chat. We also have to pick another book. We did send out a poll, and there was a fairly clear winner in the poll. Surprising to me, I have to admit, which was to read Willing, which is the second part of Hannah Arendt's unfinished book, The Life of the Mind. We did read Thinking, which is the first part of The Life of the Mind, about a year ago, or maybe a little more than a year ago. And it's an extraordinary part as well. It does seem to me a little strange to just read Willing without revisiting Thinking, because they go together. And so what we may do is read them both, but go quickly through the Thinking section and use the introductions I gave for the Thinking section as a way to speed up the process, but we'll see. So if you don't have a copy of The Life of the Mind, now would be a time to order it. It's widely available. And we will read that starting in we'll probably take a little bit of break over the summer, but we'll start with that fairly soon, probably in July. Okay. And if people have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. All right. So today we're reading sections 40, 41, and 42 of chapter 6 of The Human Condition. Chapter 6 is called the Vita Activa and the Modern Age. As I've tried to make clear, I hope clear, chapter 6 is, as an overarching ideal, a chapter about something called world and earth alienation, as Arendt understands them. The idea that we are increasingly unworldly, alienated from the world of things that surrounds us, the interest that that which is in between us. We are turned away from the world of things, the world of common sense, and moved inside of ourselves, internalized. And so the last chapter we read, chapter 39, section 39, I'm sorry, was introspection and the loss of common sense, how we move our Archimedean point inside of our mind, and we see all things in the world, be they desks or other people or the planet, not as worldly things, but as products of our mind, as things, and so all philosophy in this age of alienation, world alienation, earth alienation, all philosophy becomes largely, well, one of two kinds, a kind of theory of knowledge, right? Cognitive philosophy, a Kantist philosophy, a philosophy of how we know things. And the answer is we know things by how we think about them in our mind. The other thing philosophy becomes, as we will learn in these chapters, is zeitgeist philosophy. So a philosophy that simply tries to think through and articulate in clarity and rigor the world as it is today. What philosophy ceases to then be about is the pursuit of truth. It's not actually, it doesn't believe we can know the truth, because the one thing we are pretty certain of in this modern age, this age of alienation, is that we can't know whatever we don't make. We can't know what is outside of ourselves, and this this doubt and this belief that we can't know what is outside of ourselves basically diminishes philosophy. It becomes you know, a tool for understanding the world as it is, basically a glorified sociology, or it becomes simply a sort of second order inquiry into how we can know things that we cannot know, to what, you know, which is the critique of the critical philosophy of Kant, you know, to what extent what we can and can't know as beings who are subjects to know a world that have no access to the world. And so in these chapters, Arendt is now, she has, what she's done in chapter 6 so far is talk about the foundation of world alienation in certain events of the modern age, namely the mapping and exploration of the planet and the expropriation of the land from the peasants, and earth alienation in the event of the discovery of the telescope, and the and almost everything else in this chapter follows from that event, that Galileo event, the discovery of the telescope. The discovery of the telescope turns us, on the one hand, it seems like it turns us to the world, it turns us to observing the world, but it doesn't, because what we realize is that our observations are always doubtful, are always false, and that what it does is turn us to our theory, so that Galileo looks at mountains or looks at dark and light spots and theorizes that they must be mountains, because he has an understanding of algebra and geometry. And so what the telescope does and what the scientific age does is actually teach us to distrust our senses and teach us to know that the only way we can know the world is by submitting the world to theories that we create. And the most certain of those theories are mathematical theories. And so we see the rise of arithmetic, algebra, and even replacing geometry as a way of knowing and mastering the world. And so from that earth alienating event of the telescope to the diminishment of the senses leads not to skepticism, we're going to be told, but to a kind of optimism that we can actually make the world in our image, that we become almost like gods. Or it leads to despair, that in the fact that we can only know what we make, we are limited to a world of human creation and stuck in that, and there's nothing greater or beyond to that. And so that's where we are in these chapters. We've sort of largely gone through the scientific exploration of the roots of earth alienation, the Archimedean point, the movement of philosophy and thinking not to the world in secularization, but inside of ourselves. And now we come to, in a sense, the transitional section 40. And then with section 41, we begin the conclusion of the book. So from 41 to 40, I think 44 is the last chapter, or 45. From from 41 until 45 is the conclusion. And the conclusion is going to be about what we started with in the introduction, the reversal of the Vita Activa, how it replaces the Vita Contemplativa, and then a further set of reversals within that. Just quickly, because I think it's in many ways, chapter 40 was review. It's called Thought in the Modern World. And it starts with this claim that that doubt has prevailed over the Cartesian certainty that carries truth and certainty in myself. We have, even though there's a certainty that Descartes offers us, the overarching consequence of Cartesianism is doubt. And there's two nightmares that Arendt says emerge, that we create the world in line with our formulas, with our mathematical analyses. But then the world seems only to be made up, or a dream, a man-made world, and doesn't have a kind of independent reality. And these are the nightmares that come along with the sort of supremacy of doubt in the modern age. There's a vicious circle that Arendt describes on page 287, that the scientists formulate their hypotheses to arrange their experiments. They then use the experiments to verify their hypotheses. And during this whole enterprise, they obviously deal with a hypothetical nature. It's on 287. The basic premise, again, and I think much of this is review from earlier sections in this chapter, is that insofar as we do science through experiments, we don't actually encounter the real world. We encounter the real world, we organize the real world in an experiment through our hypotheses. And then those experiments confirm our hypotheses, or don't, but if they are done well, they do. And in such a way, we actually cease to ever encounter the world. We only encounter the world as we order it according to our theories and hypotheses. And so with the rise of science and this new internalization of thought, the movement of the Archimedean point inside of man, we in a sense eradicate the essentially given world. That doesn't mean we eradicate senses. We still have senses. Doesn't mean there isn't a given world. There is. It means that we no longer can know with certainty the given world, because we distrust our senses. And so we replace that sensible given world with a scientifically generated truth about the world. And in doing that, in replacing the sensible world, we also lose or replace a transcendent world. This is on page 288 in this chapter. In losing the sensible world, we also, if there's no sensible world, there's also no world of truth or ideas. What there is the man-made world. And so this is the conclusion. If you want to think of chapter 6 as having parts, the first section of chapter 6 is on world alienation. Call that part 1. Then you have a series of chapters on earth alienation, which lead to this, which I think culminate in section 40, with this claim that thought in the modern world means that the modern world disappears. And not only does the sensible world disappear, but also the world of truth disappear. And all that's left is a kind of man-made world. Now, section 41 begins, as I said, the conclusion, where we're at the home stretch, if you will. The argument here is in 5 parts. The first part is that contemplation is replaced by action. So that was, remember, all the way back in the introduction, that was announced. The Vita Activa, action, the life of action, reverses itself and becomes more important than contemplation. More radically, contemplation, in fact, is abandoned completely as completely useless, because if there's no transcendent world, there's no world to reveal itself to us in contemplation. And so we just completely abandon contemplation. What we have is thinking. And thinking now comes to be in the service not of some revealed truth, but in the service of action, an active doing in the world. The second reversal is that within the Vita Activa itself, the highest part of the Vita Activa, which had been action, is superseded by homo faber, fabrication, man as fabricator. So making and fabricating comes to replace not only contemplation, but action as the highest form of activity. The third step is that and she says that this idea that homo faber becomes the dominant highest activity of man in the modern age is fairly common sense. We make things, we produce things. That's what we do as modern men. And so for her, this is fairly common sense. Then another reversal is that homo faber, this idea that we produce and create things, is defeated. And it's defeated, she says, by the principle of happiness. This will be in the next chapter that we read for next week, section 43, the defeat of homo faber and the principle of happiness. The last 2 reversals are that with the rise of the principle of happiness and the defeat of homo faber, life becomes the highest good of man, not truth, as in contemplation, not action, not things produced, but simply keeping ourselves alive and reproducing ourselves. And then the 5th is that with that new principle of life as the highest good, anima laborans, labor, comes to be the highest activity of humanity in the modern age. So these are this is, you'll now see the full conclusion. And one thing we'll have to think, we should be thinking about is, she announces this thesis in the introduction. We have these chapters on public and private, then on labor, work, and action. And now we have this chapter on world alienation and earth alienation. And now we're saying, all right, the Vita Activa has inverted itself, and it's not action that is highest and most human because it provides meaning, but it's our laboring activity is the highest activity because it keeps us alive. And if you are reading with her, what that means is that the highest activity of man reduces man largely to an animal, and diminishes, if not eliminates, the distinction between man and other animals. But that's where we'll get in the next week as we read those last few chapters. That's an overarching view. Is there, I probably should say a little bit more specifically, point you to a couple of passages that are worth thinking about. Section 41 on the reversal of contemplation and action, says that from the discovery of the telescope, we realize that science does not come from an idea of progress, right? It comes from a search for truth and useless knowledge, right? That's the premise of science, and any good scientist will tell you that. I'm not out there to invent a machine. I'm out there to prove a principle. But the fundamental experience of the modern age, Arendt argues, is that truth and knowledge depend on man and what man says. So the telescope and human instruments will give us truth and certainty, not our senses. And when they give us truth and certainty, not because they magnify our senses, but because they allow us to apply theories through experiments to the world so that we control the world. In this sense, in order to be certain, she says, we must make sure, right? This is the move she makes. And to make sure means that we must subject the world to experiments. We must test it. I already talked a little bit about the break between science and philosophy. What I think is essential here is that we turn away from the world again. We turn away from not only things, but also truth, transcendence, and we turn to ourselves in this rise of action away from contemplation. The really difficult and I think maybe possibly the most difficult section of the entire book is section 42. Which is titled The Reversal Within the Vita Activa and the Victory of Homo Faber. This is a difficult section, and in many ways, she doesn't even talk so much about the victory of Homo Faber in this section. When I read this book, every time I read section 42, I'm like, oh my God, what does she mean? And then it's not till you get to section 43, where in the first paragraph, or the first two paragraphs, she actually explains what she means by the victory of Homo Faber, that we live in an age where man is productive and creative. He builds things, he makes instruments, he makes tools, he uses the means ends rationale, he finds solutions that have utility to them, and he offers a sovereignty over nature. And she says this is the sort of obvious, and that since we live in an age of production of things and fabrication of things, it seems fairly obvious that Homo Faber would become the highest principle of the modern age. But she doesn't say that till section 43. So what is section 42 about, which is titled The Reversal of the Vita Activa and the Victory of Homo Faber? It's about processes, and processes are the idea of what a process is runs throughout much of Arendt's writing at this time, and is probably, I think, one of, again, the hardest and most unclear of her concepts. I think you can make sense of it, but it's not easy. The point here, in starting on page 296, though, is that whereas if you look at 296, she says productivity and creativity, which were to become the highest ideals of the modern age in its initial stages. So productivity and creativity, Homo Faber, all right, there we get it, are inherent standards of Homo Faber, of man as the builder and fabricator. However, there is another and perhaps even more significant element noticeable in the modern version of these faculties. So in a way, she's just told us in one sentence, Homo Faber is productivity and creativity are the highest ideals. Man makes things. But there's another even more significant element. And here she's sneaking this other element in, and it is going to be important. And what is that element? She says the shift from why and what to the how implies that the actual objects of knowledge can no longer be things or eternal motions, but must be processes, and that the object of science, therefore, is no longer nature or the universe, but the history, the story of coming into being, or the nature or life of the universe. This is an enormous claim, and it's come up before a little bit, but we do need to understand it. We often ask why something happens, right? And we want a reason or a cause, a mechanical cause. We can also ask what something is, which is a harder question to answer, but especially if we haven't made it, but we can try. But the why and the what are about, well, why is this pen here, right? Well, I bought it, brought it here, we can tell it whatever. How is it made? Why is it, what is it? It's a pen, and we can tell you what a pen is. But what she says is that increasingly, there's another element in this world of Homo faber, which doesn't actually ask about the pen. It asks about how the pen got here. And how do you answer that? Well, it has very little to do with the pen. It has to do with, she says, history or the story of the coming to be of nature or the life or the universe or the pen. And the basic idea here is that what the modern world asks is not after a thing, the pen, or even the cause of the pen, but it asks after the story of the pen, the reason for the pen's existence. If I put it in that sense, the reason for the pen's existence, right? We may be able to understand her claim that the object of science shifts from nature and the universe to the story. What's the reason for it? The inventor of the first great thinker of modern science, Leibniz, argues that the first principle of science is nihil est sine ratione. Nothing is without a reason. What that means is that the pen is not without its reason, without its story, without the rational understanding of the pen and why it's here, which is a human story, a telling. And that the process of fabrication, original process, this process by which we tell the how of the pen got here, was originally the fabrication process, which disappears into the product, and it was based on the experience of Homo faber, who knew that a production process necessarily precedes the actual existence of every object. This is on top of 297. So the argument that she's making is that what Homo faber and the victory of Homo faber is based in world alienation, because it turns us away from the objects and to the story and the how and the ratio, the reason for the objects, which is something in our minds. We eventually abandon seeking to know nature, and we seek to know what's in man's mind. And this leads to her explanation of Hobbes and Leviathan, where if you know the Hobbes at all, you know that what Hobbes does is says we need an art to create a politics that is a man-made politics. So he calls it an art of man, by which we would rule the world, the man-made world, as God rules the world. And Hobbes says the only way we can do this is by looking inside ourselves, finding our feelings and our thoughts, and through this introspection, finding the rules of human nature and human psychology, and then creating, in a sense, a sovereign who will rule man according to those rules, automatically through these rules generated through mankind. For Hobbes, right, this making and reckoning, which is what he thinks of philosophy, is a kind of turn to the process, but the process unleashed by making an artificial man, right? He makes an artificial man, the state. And from Arendt's point of view, this is what Homo faber does. It seeks to make things, but make things not focused on the things, not focused on the world, but things that are based on an internal understanding of man and his needs. She thinks it will inevitably fail, right? This is the section on page 300 to 301 on the impossibility of this enterprise, because it is premised on the idea that man can reckon and reason and therefore offer a rational account of the world. That's the Hegelian aspiration. But it must leave out the fact that man is not rational, and that man will always and always fail on the rock of reality, as she says on page 301 at the top. So I think I'll stop there, because, as I said, it's hard. I'm sure you're going to have questions about it, and see if I can answer your questions if you have them. So reminder, there's two ways to ask questions. Again, in the chat, you can talk to each other. You can also raise your hands. As I said, I think section 42 is the hardest section in the whole book. You know, I assume you'll have questions about it. Thrilled to have the most trouble with in the whole book. So just putting that out there. All right. Hal, you have the first question.
Yeah, processes have often been described under certain contexts as like sort of social technologies. And some of what is being written about here almost reminds me a bit of like Heideggerianism. But I guess my question is, to what extent, because Arendt seems to be tying the rise of processes to ideas, versus maybe somebody like Marx would say like, oh, this processes thing is almost like this economic thing where everything is being economically rationalized. To what real, I mean, is her argument basically an idealist one, that as soon as we began being able to understand the world in terms of processes, via like the telescope and other things, that's what really changed things? Because it seems like she's attracted, for somebody who is a materialist, she's giving an awful lot of weight towards this idea of this like one change in perception really playing a major role in the overall development of humankind going forward, just basically because of this understanding of the world in and of itself, creating this conception of processes which now dominates our thinking.
So there's a couple things. One is clearly this whole chapter 6 is in some sense indebted to a version of idealism in which the world is, we have less and less access to the real world, and we encounter the world through the filter of our mind. And that's why a Kantist theory or cognitive theories become the main activity of philosophy. But, you know, I think we have to be somewhat careful, because she does distinguish the idea of Plato's use of the idea of Thalmadsein, or wonder, which is a wonder based in theory, right? She says on 2302, theory is in fact only another word for Thalmedzin, the contemplation of truth at which the philosopher ultimately arrives, is the philosophically purified speechless wonder from which he began. I mean, some of you know this, but I'm sure some of you don't. The image she keeps referring to here of the thinker who stops and, stops in the middle of the street and thinks, is Socrates. So if you've read the Symposium, you know that's who she's referring to. Socrates is on the way to the banquet, and he stops. The daemon appears on his shoulder, and he stops, and he engages in a few hours of thought, and largely misses the banquet, or some of the banquet, because he is stuck in thought. And so that's the image Arendt offers of contemplation, and the contemplation of a theory or of a wonder at an idea. Plato himself, though, often describes his things through, metaphors of work, of the ship's steering, or the hunter, or the shoemaker, or whatever. And so Arendt says already there, we see a move away from Thalmedzin. So I think it's important to, just to sort of resist how a little bit this claim of sort of pure idealism, because what she's arguing is not that in the world of Homo faber we have an idea and we actualize it, right? That's sort of still based in a kind of contemplation. It's that we demand certainty, and we produce and create things, and in producing and creating things, we make the world largely in our image.
I guess it was more about like taking an idealist perspective, i.e., like tracing the root of major changes in human history and humankind in ideas, rather than as Marx does in like forces of production or the way we interact with the world in other ways. I guess maybe it is because I've been so personally influenced by Marx, but just the fact that like, oh, now we can kind of see processes, therefore an entire way of the world changes, or an entire way of going about things, versus processes begin to dominate our lives because of the way the economy operates in the modern age, or various things like that. It just seems to me, I guess maybe wrongly, you can have your own judgments about like that would be the creator of such a major change, versus what the actual initiating cause of the processing would kind of be.
I have to admit, I'm not totally clear on the question. I'm sure that's me.
I guess maybe it wasn't. No, I'm pretty sure it wasn't me. It was me being like obtuse or not making sense. It's in the sense that she's looking at the world and she's saying this major change in the way we think of things was the cause behind all of these other changes, versus saying that, let's say, capitalism, or the way things developed during this period via the Renaissance, or if you wanted to trace this to more later time periods, that's what gave rise to this kind of idea of process, versus the idea of process leading to all of these other things. Like tracing the movement of history in terms of ideas, rather than ideas in terms of the movement of other things in history.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, she's going to suggest that the rise of processes is a result of world alienation, and earth alienation, and us turning away. and at this and turning away from the world, turning into ourselves, and thus imposing a kind of human understandable mathematical or other formula onto the world. And once we do that, the world actually has to follow a story that has a reason to it. It has to be a rational story. And so we make the world rational. We make it into a process. Marx, of course, is an example of that. Marx tries to fit the world into a story. So does Hegel, right? I mean, that's the connection between Marx and Hegel. That's how history becomes the sort of dominant discipline of all modern science, including natural science. That's her claim, that even natural science now is based in a kind of rational story that we tell, rather than in concerned with the objects in the world. Robert McKay.
Well, can you hear me better than you could before?
It's still not great, Robert, I have to admit, but
okay, then I won't ask the question and leave it to other people.
You want to try? If you can make it brief, we'll try, because I can still hear you.
Well,
it just in out.
I have trouble with her overall notion of the modern age, but I'll put that aside and focus on something she says about Descartes and Galileo on page 289.
Yep.
Starting section 41, she says, the discovery of the Archimedean point and the concomitant rise of Cartesian doubt. Forgive me, but I don't think those things had anything to do with each other. You can have Cartesian doubt without the telescope. You can have Cartesian doubt with the telescope. And I also have trouble with her assertion that looking through the telescope and other scientific instruments has anything to do with being suspicious about our access to reality. It just seems like a made-up connection to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll tell you how I see them connected. She's not saying there's a causal. Concomitant sort of means they happen, in connection with one another, I believe. But doubt about our senses, just to use one example, leads us to check our senses with instruments. Doubt about God leads us away from God, not back to the world, but into ourselves. Doubt leads us ultimately away from the world, into ourselves, and leads us to seek a kind of certainty which can only be found from a view outside of the world, which is the Archimedean point. And thus it turns us towards mathematics, towards algebra, and a kind of universal science. So that's the connection as I see it. It's not a causal connection or anything like that, but she thinks that it's not an accident that at the same time that doubt becomes the dominant way of thinking about the world, the response to doubt is a scientific approach that looks at the world from outside the world or inside our minds, and thus from a non-worldly perspective as a way of getting knowledge of it.
As if Newton, Leibniz, or Leibniz and Clarke had any worry about Cartesian doubt. I mean, they seem to be two simply different processes.
Well, I mean, I'll speak for Leibniz, not for Leibniz, I'll speak about Leibniz because I, at least at one point, knew him quite well. Spotting the crisis and the theological doubt and doubt about the world. I'm getting a note that my internet connection is unstable. Are you guys hearing me?
Yeah, I
No?
hear you.
We
I
hear-
hear you,
Okay.
yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
You didn't hear what
Okay.
came before, how you started off on Leibniz.
So Leibniz responds to the, as does Hobbes, by the way, and in a certain extent, as does Descartes, are responding to the, the theological crisis of the 17th century, but also the political crisis, the 30 Years' War, which is only resolved in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, by which we agree, the different states of Europe agree to basically let each state govern itself, because we don't know what the true confession is, if you will. I don't know if Robert will accept that reading. But these are all folks engaged in trying to think through what doubt means and how to respond to doubt by finding some certainty. And the Archimedean point of universal science is sort of the sort of greatest achievement of that. Okay. Robert,
I think what upset people about Descartes, as he says in the discourse, was not his doubt, but his association with the new physics and the new astronomy. But I'll leave it at that.
yeah, but just so you know, doubt does not mean skepticism. Doubt means doubt, which can lead to great optimism, that we can know the world through human intervention. So doubt doesn't mean skepticism. So I hope that maybe that helps. I don't know. She says that somewhere in here, that doubt doesn't mean skepticism. It means optimism and despair. It's on page 293, right? In the middle of the page, the conviction that objective truth is not given to man, right? That's part of the crisis of the 17th century, but that he can know only what he makes himself is not the result of skepticism, but of a demonstrable discovery, namely the telescope or other things, and therefore does not lead to resignation, but either to redoubled activity, hope or optimism, or to despair. The world loss of modern philosophy, whose introspection discovered consciousness as the inner sense, is different not only in degree from the age-old suspicion of the philosophers toward the world. The philosopher no longer turns from the world of deceptive perishability to another world of eternal truth, but turns away from both and withdraws into himself. And what he discovers in himself, in the inner self, is not an image whose permanence can be beheld and contemplated, not an idea, an eidos, as Howe was talking about, but on the contrary, the constant movement of sensual perceptions and the no less constantly moving activity of the mind. Well, we have our senses bouncing into ourselves and our mind turning around. And that's all we really have. And then when we have our theories of how we manipulate those senses through science or through universal science, through mathematics. And it's that, and that's the connection between doubt and the Archimedean point. Susan.
Yes. First of all, thank you for the comments around section 42, because I didn't know if it was just me. So more than ever, I was confused. But here's my question, I guess. And based upon your answer, all the other questions I have may be not relevant or not correct. Is Arendt, is she saying that the doubting, when we began doubting our senses, yeah, she talks about doubting our senses leads to this not being able to, or being alienated from the real world. Yes, is that a basic, do I have that right?
Well, we doubt our senses and we turn inside ourselves to a certain degree. And in turning inside ourselves, we seek to know the world with certainty based on our knowledge, based on our way of organizing the world. And so, yes.
So okay, so that's interesting to me, and maybe it's, and I was not, I'm a literature humanitarian background, but appreciate science and its method enough to say, I don't know why that this is, I know this is her perception, is that it causes us, our doubting of our senses causes us to draw into ourselves. But I just, I don't, it's just a comment, I guess. I mean, I don't see that with exploration. I see it as a means to get out of ourselves, this Archimedean point, right? To know beyond what we're cooking up in our own selves. I mean, I get that whole notion of that. But to me, the science, and she does seem to kind of dwell in on mathematics, which of course is the underpinning for many sciences, but yet not all. So there's this concept. I want to say one more thing just to see if you know about it. There's a concept called the extended mind. Roger, do you know of Andy Clark and David Chalmers, the extended mind?
I don't, but
okay, it's very fascinating because it talks exactly, I'll just, after this, I'll email you just something you might be interested in. But it takes up this subject of the tools that we create, right, as Homo but the tools that we create, those tools are not this, and somewhere she says, right in the beginning of 42, which kind of bugged me, she said, it's in the first paragraph, she says, from then on, all scientific progress has been most intimately tied up with the ever more refined development in the manufacture of new tools and instruments. I really took exception to that, not being a scientist even. That she kind of makes it sounds like, oh, science is just involved in making all these tools and stuff. I just, that really blew me away. So the extended mind is all about these tools, the telescope on, that actually have allowed us to, as an extension of our cognitive mind. And maybe, this is the way humanity is going. So I know, not really a question for you, but
I don't think
comments that bugged me. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think that's an insult to scientists, but I think it's a good point, and it relates to your first question. And I think in an extended mind, as I totally unschooled and am trying to understand it, fits with what she's saying. Well, I want to come back to that. And I want to bring you back to chapter 40 on page 287. Because here's where she's talking, here's where she's like the most clearly citing the scientists. And it might be helpful for us to look at this paragraph. It's a long paragraph on 287. And I think this, well, I don't know if it'll help any of you, because I think a lot of you are having similar questions and pushbacks against this idea of internalization. So here's, I think, where one of the places where she accounts for it. So she says, Cartesian doubt, logically the most plausible and chronologically the most immediate consequence of Galileo's discovery. We can pause on that if you'd like, but the idea is that Galileo's discovery causes us to doubt. our senses, okay?
Mhm.
And doubt our ability to know the world, was assuaged for centuries through the ingenious removal of the Archimedean point into man himself, at least in natural science. So if we move the universal science and the Archimedean point into man, we can create formulas, universal formulas, therefore algebraic formulas, that work anywhere and everywhere, that allow us to, even though our senses are inadequate, allow us to have certainty about the world. Does that make sense, Susan, or not?
It makes sense so far. Absolutely.
so-
Yeah, that's
All
good.
right, good.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just going
yeah.
to try and go through it, right?
Yeah,
But
it's
the
good.
mathematization of physics, by which the absolute renunciation of the senses for the purpose of knowing was carried through. So as we mathematize physics, we renounce the senses, because what's true are the formulas, not the things.
Mhm.
And that's, I mean, that's fairly, I think, obvious. I mean, you know, you've never seen a vacuum. There's never been a vacuum, but the theory, the mathematics is true, even if you've never seen it. And so we mathematize physics, and we renounce the senses. They can be deceiving, and we care more about the theory than the senses. Had in its last stages the unexpected and yet plausible consequence that every question man puts to nature is answered in terms of mathematical patterns to which no model can ever be adequate, since one would have to be shaped after our sense experiences. So now this is somewhat based on an insight she talks about more in The Life of the Mind, in the section on thinking, which we may read again next, where she says that, you know, all thinking has to be based on sense experience. You know, even things we think that, you know, if we think a unicorn, we still think, you know, horse wings, things we know. We can't think outside of our language that we know. And yet mathematical language is something we can't conceive. And so she footnotes Erwin Schrödinger, right? And she quotes Schrödinger's book, Science and Humanism. And the quote she offers is, as our mental eye penetrates into smaller and smaller distances and shorter times. Notice Schrödinger's word, our mental eye. He's talking about the mathematization of physics. He's talking about how we increasingly look at the world of super small things, not that we can't see, atoms, nanoatoms. I mean, I don't even know what all these particles are called that physicists talk about today, right? That no one's ever seen, but are based on calculations. And as our mental eye penetrates into these smaller and smaller and shorter distances and times, we find nature behaving so entirely differently from what we observe in visible and palpable bodies of our surrounding that no model shaped after our large scale, namely our sensible experiences, can ever be true, such that the true world that mathematical Archimedean point science is giving us means that nothing we could ever sensibly conceive could be true. And so that's part of this doubt about the world. That's part of the internalization. And, you know, what she says in the text is, this is an unexpected but plausible consequence, because when we make experiments and we put our questions to the world, they're answered in terms of math that can't be visualized. She continues, at this point, the connection between thought and sense experience inherent in the human condition seems to take its revenge. So inherent in the human condition, again, a big claim that thought is founded on sense experience, that all thought is metaphorical, and there's that all of our thinking is founded and has its origin in things we see or sense, hear, smell, etc. But while technology demonstrates the truth of modern science's most abstract concepts, it demonstrates no more than that man can always apply the results of his mind, that no matter which system he uses for the explanation of natural phenomena, he will always be able to adopt it as a guiding principle for making and acting. Increasingly, what science sees the world as is a system, a result of a way our mind, this Archimedean point that's abstracted, that's nowhere, that's outside of the sensible world. And this possibility was latent even in the beginnings of modern mathematics, when it turned out that numerical truths can be fully translated into spatial relationships. This is sort of, that funny math, right? There, that math can lead to shapes and designs that have never been seen in the world. If therefore present day science in its perplexity points to technical achievements to prove that we deal with an authentic order given in nature. Footnote 52, Heisenberg, in Grundlagen, right? It seems it has fallen into a vicious circle, which I quoted earlier, which can be formulated as follows. Scientists formulate their hypotheses to arrange their experiments and then use these experiments to verify their hypotheses. During this whole enterprise, they obviously deal with a hypothetical nature. We're actually not dealing with nature in a true sense. We're dealing with nature as we've organized it. And she then has a footnote that this point is best illustrated by a statement of Planck, Max Planck, quoted in a very illuminating article by Simone Weil. And unfortunately, I didn't have time to check the French. I don't know if anyone did and wants to offer a translation, but this is Max Planck.
So Roger, she's just saying,
Okay.
I mean, she's saying then that we can never get away from ourselves. We can never get out of ourselves. Because even when we think we're getting this distance from the world and we're discovering all these great, and I'm saying it in quotes, truths of nature, we're really not, because it's a product of it's a product of the experiments that we are creating. Yeah. That ultimately we're the creator, right? So how do you ever get, how do you ever get out of that? You don't. I don't know if that's a bad thing. Sometimes I think she makes it sound kind of like dire, but maybe
it's not that it's good or bad. It's what's happened, right?
Yeah,
the point is not to good or bad it. It's to say it's happened.
Yeah.
But what it does mean is that we are increasingly alienated from the world, and the world becomes something that we create through a kind of universal science. One thing that does is it completely destroys contemplation as a meaningful activity, because contemplation is to contemplate the world as it is. And if the world as it is, we can never know, contemplation disappears as a meaningful activity. But the second thing is that in order to, and this comes back to, this is the second part of your question, Susan, the beginning of section 42. If the only way we can know the world is through our working in it, working on it, that's why Homo faber becomes victorious, because we now have to work upon the world. We have to act upon the world in order to know it. And because of that, we increasingly need to experience the world through experiments. And you can think of natural science experiments, which is what we've been talking about, but think about how central psychological and economic and sociological experiments have become to the way we see the world. Think of the Stanley Milgram experiments for obedience, or all the experiments people offer about, what we trust and what we don't trust, and things of that sort. We increasingly in the moral world and in the ethical world and in the economic world, we see the world through experimentalization. And that requires, in natural science, that requires tools. That's why she says that we need these tools to do it. And that's the kind of world alienation. And what that means is that we never encounter the things of the world. All we encounter are the how of these things, which are the processes. That's the, I find the word processes not very helpful. Maybe it's just me.
No, it's difficult. I have the same problem. I'm thinking as well.
But I think I get what she's trying to get at, right? I mean, to me, what she's trying to say is that there's a story, there's a reason, and we don't pay attention to the things themselves. We pay attention to their reasons and their stories. And that I think is right. I mean, in fact, that was the thesis of my first book on Leibniz, right? Which I've mentioned once or twice, which is an attempt to understand the importance of nihilist
Roger, could I break in for just a minute?
Okay.
The notion of process she's using comes from Whitehead's Process and Reality. Whitehead's someone she quotes on the same page.
Yeah.
Yes,
So it didn't book.
I know Whitehead as well, Robert. Thank you. Yes, yes,
No.
exactly.
And it's
Absolutely.
connected with her stress on the new historical consciousness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That nature is a process, she says in footnote 61, that therefore the ultimate fact for sense awareness is an event, that natural science deals only with occurrences, happenings, or events, but not with things that apart from happenings, there is nothing. See Whitehead, The Concept of Nature, belongs among the axioms of modern natural science in all its branches. Absolutely. I read Whitehead very productively. He was a big part of my book, The Gift of Science. I just still find the word process unhelpful personally. This is not a critique of Arendt. Some people may understand it well. It doesn't do much for me. The way I understand it,
history instead. Use history instead.
Yeah, okay, history or story or reason. I take it from Leibniz. Nothing is without a reason. That means that the things of the world are not until you give them a reason. That's my understanding of how this works. And to me, that makes more sense than process, or history. I mean, but again, everyone can do it their own way. So I think I understand what Arendt's meaning because I've done this my own self with my book on Leibniz, the reason. I worry that I'm missing what she's saying because I'm bringing my own understanding to it, but that's as far as I can get. And I haven't gone and done a close reading of the Concept of Nature by Whitehead. I read his other book on science, his other great book on science, which he cites at the very beginning of this chapter, on the Galileo chapter, the Galileo section. But what is it called? Science in the Modern World. That's the book of his I know. Anyway, I hope that helps a little bit with this idea of process and also with the idea of the internalization, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. It was excellent, Roger. Thank you. It was a lot. There's a lot in there to contemplate. Excuse the word.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Can't say that anymore. Spiros, you're up.
Thanks, Roger. Hi there. Thanks
Hi.
a lot. There is a key concept there for me, Roger, which is the word world. We are talking all the time about world this, world that. Okay, so I think it's a key concept. And I think it's good to define it. At first, I would say that maybe it comes from Heidegger. I'm not sure. So I would like to know some things from you there. And then I have to give you a schema here, and I would like to know if I'm right, according to your opinion. What is world exactly? World consists of different things. We have one world with different aspects. So let's say that according to Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber, we have the world as this in-between, which is the political world, the world of homo politicus. Then we have the world as a thing, which is thing in the sense of the object. So this is homo faber. The word comes from homo faber, the fabrication, as you said. And then maybe another aspect, the third one, the third image of the world is the world as a whole, whatever it is, soil, earth, planet, I don't know, I'm not sure, the cosmological maybe meaning or sense of world. And this is homo laborans or animal laborans, I don't know. So I would like to know for you, what is the real meaning of world? Is there any superiority between them? For example, the political world for Arendt, this is my opinion, is superior than the other one. So for me, world is the relationships between the citizens, the people in public sphere, is whatever Martin Buber defines as in between. So the world is not forever. Each day, at the end of the day, the world corrupts. So the other day, early in the morning, we as people, as citizens, we have to remake the world anew. This is the real world, not the things, not the cosmological one, but the political one. But I would like to know your opinion, Roger. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I think you've done a pretty good job of articulating what world means. The world for Arendt is what we share. It's the things that are in between. It's the things that, it's what lasts. There's for her, there's things of nature, but then there's a humanly created world. And that human created world is one that constantly is being, you said corrupted or something. She doesn't use that language all the time, but sometimes she does. It's in danger of being lost, and we have to care for it and protect it. That world in the essay on education is the world that we have to protect against the newcomers. And yet it's also, we need to protect the newcomers against that world so that they can change it. It's not just a political world, it's also the world of houses and people and pens. But it's all the things that make up our home as a place where we live and die and act. So, Arendt, so Vita Activa, I never sort of sits down and says, here's what I mean by world. Maybe someone can point me to that. But I think it's I think she has a very common sense. She has a very strong sense of what the world means, and there's a natural world and there's a humanly created world. And it's what we share and where we live and where our home is. I think it's not how Heidegger uses the word world, but I think it's a Heideggerian idea in some sense. But I mean, I don't think that's saying anything per se. It's certainly not how Heidegger uses the word world, at least in essays like The Origin of the Work of Art. It's almost the opposite of that. But I think there's a way in which you have to think about what the world is, but I also think it's a mistake to complicate it too much. The world is what we share, where we live, what we create, what we bring to be, all those things. Okay. Lena.
Thank you, Roger. And thank you for doing the session from Ljubljana as well in your, supposedly free time. Well, I was thinking about kind of how we, with certain words, they either have like a good or a bad quality. I know this is oversimplifying it, but in academia, word in my field, word process is kind of imbued with like good things. And so is, for example, action, and so is politics, and words like that, which kind of carry some kind of goodness within us. Whilst, for example, contemplation is something considered, well, not so good as if. And like, for example, I found myself doing an art project once I first had my children, which was called Contemplation Time. I had no idea about anything of this, but in a way it kind of came to me as this wondering about the world, this kind of amazement about the world and the stillness and thinking about it. Okay, why am I saying all of this? Is because there is this quote which she says, it's on page 296, and it says, in the place of the concept of being, we now find the concept of process. And it's almost like being is this good word and process is this bad thing. And of course, we've already talked about what is process, is this history and storytelling and how we conceive it within our human, position. But I kind of wonder, how does this relate to the concept of action that we really had a big chapter on? Isn't this process also something that allows us action, actually, that is much more active rather than this being and ideas that's static? Like why lament the concept of being? Why lament this world which is, no longer here? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it's almost like I wonder, why lament, this lost world of being, of ideas, of the thing itself, of the what and the why rather than the how? Because it is the how, to me, at least in my reading of this book, that is more connected to the concept of action, which is a bit more changeable, a bit more capable of natality and possibility.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, for just to first say, I don't think that we should attribute goodness to being and badness to process. She's not so caught up in being. In fact, she often says that appearance is more important than being. I think she's simply talking about something that's changed with this new era. On the other point, which I think is a really interesting question, and I'm trying to think it through, is that insofar as we cease to think about beings as being, and think about them as process, or if you'll bear with me, as reason or ground, being, she says, appears and discloses itself. In process, the reason or the ground or the history or the story remains invisible. And it can only be inferred from the presence of certain phenomena. This is just following on the quote you read on 297. This process was originally the fabrication process, which disappears in the product. And it was based on the experience of Homo faber, who knew that a production process necessarily precedes the actual existence of every object. Insofar as we're talking about process or reasons or stories, the process, reason, or story is not what's visible when you see the pen or the bridge or the artwork or whatever. You have to, in a sense, tell that process and apply that, take that thing and analyze it and tell its history or its reason or its process. In doing so, right? You do act insofar as you insert a process into the world. And since that process is supposed to be a reason, a rational law, other things are then going to be understood according to that law or process. And so every time someone does something like that, which is to unearth a process which explains things, they are acting into the world and remaking the world in accordance with now this new theory or reason that we've created, which is why she's going to say, I think in the next chapter, I don't remember exactly, that the locus of action in the modern world has shifted from politics to science. It is scientists, more so than politicians, who act into the world. Because in discovering the reasons, grounds, stories, processes, whichever word we're going to use, the scientist begins to remake the world, does something new, surprising. They act. And in acting, insert a new theory, a new reason, a new process, a new ground into the world that if others pick it up and use it, will change the way we experience and see the world. And so she says the scientists have become the true actors in the modern world. I think that's in the next chapter. I don't remember.
Roger, and she also discusses that point in detail in section 32, called the process character of action.
Right, back in 32, yeah. Yeah, we talked about it back then too, but it's good to, that's really helped, yeah. Section 32 is the process character of action. And so a lot of this is when this all came up back then too, when we were talking about Heisenberg and other scientists, with regard.
It was about, she explained that how the experiment forced natural processes into man-made patterns.
Right.
So natural science became exclusively about process.
Right. So that's the last chapter of action before she gets to the things on forgiveness and promising. And it's the way in which action, undoes itself and becomes the product, the province of scientists, not statesmen. We're now back at it here in this chapter on how Homo faber replaces action as the highest human activity. It's not an accident, right? The last section of action before you have this sort of, I think, digression on promising and forgiveness is about the process character of action. And here what we're learning is that the process character of action displaces the sort of actor with the producer, fabricator. That's helpful. Thank you, Dina.
Yes, and may I just add that she does have a big section here as well about how philosophy has become secondary to science and to history. So it is that similar narrative, really.
Yeah. Thanks, Lena. Are there other questions? Oh, there are a couple that came up. Amanda, I think, is next, right? Amanda.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, I wanted to, I don't know, I guess just make some observations that I had in reference to, you know, what's also kind of happening in the 20th century with artists, especially in New York at that time. And because when I keep hearing, you know, the word action and process, I just can't help thinking of what's going on with artists like Jackson Pollock and action painting, and you know, that being kind of a very novel form of abstract art in that time in the 50s, also when Arendt was thinking and active. But also, you know, what Pollock is known to say, that I am nature, and that there's this internalization of what one considers as nature, in terms of, at least from the artist's perspective, what the artwork becomes, and also what the artist becomes as a kind of conduit of the outside world, but also the senses. And I also thought it was interesting how in the early 20th century, with the advent of Cubism, but also the theories of relativity by Einstein, which are being understood around the same time, even though they're not related, there's this interesting kind of parallel between what's going on in science and arts, and perhaps other forms of thinking that the modern age has revealed, or, you know, kind of goes in some kind of direction that affects fields working and innovating at the same time. And also so if we're talking about process, I don't know if this relates to how, you know, Arendt is thinking about process, but there's definitely an evolution in art from that form of action to a kind of process that becomes less about an object and more about, you know, what that implies. And so I just thought it was kind of interesting how, you know, these things that she's pointing out about the time that she's living in and the world that she's living in are kind of being reflected in these areas. And, you know, art is the one that I know more about. And so I just wanted to know what your thoughts are, especially about, you know, that famous statement, I am nature, you know, that, you know, comes from a place that I don't think he was ever reading Arendt.
So what was the statement again, Amanda?
I am nature.
By whom?
By Jackson Pollock.
Ah,
I don't, yeah. So
first of all, I want to thank you for the comment. You know, I'm still processing it. I'm not sure I should say that. The I am nature comment, which I thought that's what you said, but I was having trouble with it. Strikes me as quite similar to what she's saying about Hobbes, right? That, you know, that the only way I can know the world is know myself. And Hobbes says his whole theory is an attempt to know himself. Nietzsche calls himself a great psychiatrist. The idea is that philosophy, political philosophy, all creativity comes from now looking in oneself. And so not knowing anything about Jackson Pollock of worth, from based on just what you said, it strikes me that what Pollock is doing is saying, I am nature. If you want to know what the world is, look at me and look at what I do. It's the same internalization. It's the same world alienation that Arendt is describing and as part of the consequence of earth alienation and world alienation, and the rise of doubt and the Archimedean point going inside oneself. And so I think the comment you're making is right on, that the art world is experiencing the same turning inward to understand the world.
Yes.
that she's describing in politics, in natural science, in all fields. And so I think it's a helpful comment. I'm not sure I can say much more about it, but I think it's really helpful.
Right. I guess where I'm also kind of going with this is that, that was a radical statement for people making art in that period, because it was before that much more of the world, the object and of the world. And so, but it was also considered, the major break in innovation for but it, what one considers as an image or as a work of art in that period, and it opened up the entire world to a different way of understanding that. And so, at least in that sense, it's not considered something pejorative. It's considered something quite innovative, internalization and going, I guess, away from the world, because it also somewhere offered a kind of freedom from the world, which, as we have said sometimes, isn't always, the world isn't always the same for everybody. And so abstraction,
I think that's right.
But I know that the freedom that I'm talking about here is very different from the Arendt's freedom that you have pointed out to me multiple times. But I guess where I'm going with this is, it seems that Arendt is raising flags with these observations, whereas I think the scientists, were, very happy to be more deep into like quantum theory and things that you cannot see and internalize. I mean, things that you cannot see and touch and sense. And so I'm wondering, what that, I guess, what your thoughts are on that.
This comes back to the question of, whether being is positive or any of these are positive or negative. And I really I don't think that's how they should be read. I mean, Arendt says that this offers great hope and optimism, but also despair, depending on how you look at it. I don't think you should put a value on this. I think you should realize that it leads to both optimism and despair. Optimism in the sense that I think, as you're expressing it in the art world, there's a kind of incredible open possibility to express truths inside of ourselves that are real. Despair in that all we have are truths inside of ourselves and we can never know the world. That's the insight, not to put a positive or negative on it. I saw Vivian wanted to jump in. I see your hands up. I know there's some people ahead of her, but Vivian, do you want to speak to this particular point or something else?
Yes, I do. Actually, prior to this earlier on, Roger, I wanted to question you much more specifically on what you meant by process. However, I do appreciate what you just said now. I think what you just said now is is crucial in terms of not focusing on the sort of positive or the extent of the lament in here, whether there is a lament of loss or not, because I think that it's exactly as you say, perhaps, which is in the, I mean, the book is titled, well, at least in English, The Human Condition, which she must have titled as well, The Hope and Despair. And I think that's the point. But but coming back to process, because I think that actually, as much as you've spoken about it, I didn't really hear, in a sense, the completion of an idea as to exactly what or how you understand process. But I didn't hear Amanda as clearly as I would have liked to have heard. But I don't think that there is I don't think that the crucial point in let's say postmodernism is a dichotomy or between action and process. I think that it's helpful for me when I try to think what process means when we're reading Arendt. When and right in the very beginning, when Roger, when we started with the 8 essays, or you know, the
past and
what is it? Sorry.
Between past and future.
Exactly, where she speaks actually right in the beginning also about process. And it's illuminating when you think of postmodern art, the process, let's say in the late 50s, with the advent of performance art, art events, art happenings, and abstract action art, as in Pollock. I only mention Pollock only because Amanda mentions him. I wouldn't mention him in this context at all otherwise. It had, for me, in my understanding, it's more illuminating to think of the idea of process as explaining the art-life dichotomy, not the action process, because process is action too. So it's the art-life thing, where in terms of how in Western thought, how art was not life, or where it intersected with life, where it was taken for life, and again in postmodern art and in contemporary art, thinking about the relationship between art and life. And I think that that's what the term process really addressed more than anything. So and then just to say that process is action, and I suppose that coming back to what you said last, Roger, about you didn't say the human condition is hope and despair, but you said that not to valorize one over the other. I suppose it boils down to how invested we are in the life of thinking and contemplation, as opposed to a life that where that is diminished, because and it might just be, as you say, that this is neither good nor bad. This is our human condition. But if we don't see it in that way, then this book is her contemplation of this issue is a sort of unrelenting march from the beginning to the end of along the path of diminishment, which is, of course, very difficult to put a positive spin on that. But if one does not automatically or assume that the life of thought and contemplation is the life to which, you know, we metaphysically aspire, then yes, hope and despair is certainly our human condition. So does that make any sense to you? Does it help in terms of process? Or does it change anything?
Hey, Roger.
Changes.
Roger, can I just, the Pollock quote? The Pollock quote was in response to a conversation with Hans Hofmann, who was a bit of a mentor to him. Hans Hofmann was suggesting that Pollock work from nature. And Pollock responded, "Work from nature? I am nature." That's the story.
Yes, but it goes a little bit deeper than that in the sense that, you know, a lot of art, if there, I mean, there isn't a linear, but a lot of the art that was made before that point was having to do not really about the self and the artist and the self. It had to do with the difference between that and the nature that was outside of the artist. And so in order to make that statement, it was also a kind of different understanding as to, you know, how the artist positioned itself vis-a-vis nature and the outside world.
So Roger, if you could just address a sort of a more complete definition or understanding that you have of process, then in maybe in considering some things that I might have mentioned. I mean, is process like the difference between, well, being and becoming? I mean, is that what it is? You know, because becoming has unknowns, uncertainties, non-static aspects, obviously, to it, or associations or ideas.
I don't think it's becoming, because process has a human, willful, rational element to it that I don't think becoming has.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think process has process for Arendt means fundamentally looking beyond or beyond a thing, the things of nature, the things of that we see, anything, and asking for its how, its story, its reason, and that and in doing so, elevating above the beings or the things, the story, reason for the things, and thus further taking us away from the things and into the sort of the sort of grand theoretical narratives and stories and reasons for how the things happen. In doing so, on the one hand, process within action, in a sense, leads to non-action, and process as part of fabricating, as we've just been saying, leads us to produce products based upon processes, reasons, stories, in which the reasons, product, stories disappear, and yet those reasons are in many ways more important than the products. And so the products are there almost as markers of the process, if that's something I can say. You don't, I mean, again, I'm going to speak out of school here, but you don't see the Pollock painting for itself. You see it as a illustration of the power of the process. And
Because there's a deep
But-
problematic using the term illustration, but we'll let that slide for the moment because, yeah. Okay.
sorry.
But Roger, there's also a large element in this book about process being aligned with the discussion of a natural process of growth and consumption of the life process. And in fact, she'll say at the beginning of the book that this concept of process has become, the all-important concept in the modern age because it mirrors the rise of the animal laborants.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're going to get to next week, right? So,
Right.
insofar as
process is also about consumption, and it's also about the life process, and it's about elevating that above and beyond, what the Homo faber does when she produces.
right. So,
Absolutely it is.
what we've been talking about so far is the victory of Homo faber. We're going to next week talk about the defeat of Homo faber, which is going to be at the hand of another process, right? And you're absolutely right.
Can I add one thing? Sorry, it's
Yeah.
Tara. I just wanted to add that I always think of process in relation to like the Darwinism and evolution, and that what we're discovering in the obsession with process is a series of laws.
Yeah.
that process is about not understanding a thing, but understanding a process, like how life unfolds, or how history works when she's talking about Marx. And so I always root it in her critiques of both, Marxism and pretty much fascism in terms of kind of race thinking or a kind of economic determinism, and that it's process thinking that allows for ideology. And that's part of the danger of it, that the kind of insistence on ideology in the political sphere, the kind of making of realities, starts to match or mirrors what's happening in science, right? That the experiment then comes to almost create the reality that it needs. So I just wanted to offer that as another anchor for thinking through process, because for me, I always ground it in the way that totalitarianism for her becomes just all process. It in fact, it can't perpetuate, it has to always be in motion. So that process is also related to motion.
Tara, I meant to imply that when I was speaking about process in art from the time of the 50s, from body art and happenings and conceptual art and the diversion of art and life. Yes, so that different realities are created, as she said, and as we discussed earlier in this text several times. Yeah.
Thank you. Dina, your hand is up. Do you have something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, I had a question.
Go ahead.
So I was wondering if there is a bit of a paradox in the discussion throughout the book of how our need for stability has motivated the various reversals she discussed in section 42. And along the way, at the same time, she describes how that movement of reversal also always requires a renunciation. So, for example, in the mathematization of physics, we renounce our reliance on the senses for the purpose of certainty. Earlier, in one of the earlier stages of renunciation, we actually renounce work for contemplation. So throughout, in each one of these reversals, there's an element of renunciation, which is paradoxical, isn't it? In the sense that we have something that we are basing ourselves upon, and yet we renounce it in an effort to reverse it, to become more, to get more stability, even though there's already something that we have been doing for the purpose of a certain level of certainty or stability.
Yeah.
And so in a way, what she's describing in these movements of reversal and renunciation is also inbuilt a movement of the new, or else it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, I mean, these are not like conscious renunciations, right? I mean, it's not like we consciously renounce contemplation or consciously renounce action. They happen, and they are part of they happen because of a series of events that leads us down these roads.
Actually, she describes it as us being, that, for example, on page 3 or 4, that Homo faber was persuaded to renounce. So the way that she uses the word renunciation does involve a certain element. It's not it does involve a certain conscious substitution or replacement. The word renunciation comes up in 303, page 303, and 297. So each time there's this sort of, it's not an unconscious, not entirely unconscious, I should say.
Let's just read that paragraph on 304. Thus, it was not primarily the philosopher and philosophic speechless wonder that molded the concept and practice of contemplation and the Vita Activa, but rather Homo faber in disguise. And this is what I was talking about with Plato before, right? That he brings in examples of Homo faber in his discussions of contemplation. It was man, the maker fabricator, whose job it is to do violence to nature in order to build a permanent home for himself, and who now was persuaded to renounce violence together with all activity, to leave things as they are. So he's persuaded to renounce violence together with all activity, to leave things as they are, and to find his home in the contemplative dwelling in the neighborhood of the imperishable eternal. This is Plato, right? Not today.
Right.
Homo faber could be persuaded to this change of attitude because he knew contemplation and some of its delights from his own experience. He did not need a complete change of heart, a true pedagogue, a radical turnabout. All he had to do was let his arms drop and prolong indefinitely the act of holding the eidos. So this is about Plato. This is about Homo faber and Plato, in a sort of an ancient idea, more so than I think today's.
Well, the more recent one is on 287, which describes the renunciation of this 287.
287.
Yeah.
8, yeah.
2887.
Where?
Which describes first full paragraph, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6
There's only one
lines
full
down.
paragraph.
So it's the paragraph starts with Cartesian doubt, and the sentence is in the sort of 6 lines down, but the mathematization of physics by which the absolute renunciation of the senses for the purpose of knowing was carried through.
Yeah, but that's in the passive. I mean, again, I don't see that as conscious,
But clearly, every step of reversal requires a replacement or substitution, a renunciation of what came before. Yeah. And that act of renunciation,
and you renounce the senses for something else. You don't just renounce the senses, you renounce it for the power to make the world.
Yes, even
Which
though
is-
that which came before the senses, your reliance on the senses gave you a certain level of stability, you know, for
Yeah.
a
But now-
long period of time.
But
And it's
part of
interesting
it
that you
is
want to.
part of it, Dina, is that we've entered this period of doubt where that stability is in question. And so that's what, in a sense, is the impetus for renouncing and adopting a new approach that will be more stable, or hopefully be more stable.
Even though we're oftentimes convinced to remain with what we've believed, much of this book is also about remaining convinced by what we've, you know, by tradition and by what we've believed for the longest.
Well, I mean, again, I've tried to say, I don't think this is a nostalgic book. I don't think Arendt wants us to go back. She's trying to make us aware of both what we've lost and what we've gained and where we are. And suggesting to us that instead of simply unconsciously going along with these processes, we make a decision to, you know, try and impact where we're going. That we try and act in ways that will have an impact on this process that's happening, on this story that's happening.
Definitely.
My point was only that in our pursuit for stability, we also take risks, which I think is
Absolutely. Yeah,
you know,
I think that's right.
How sort of the miracle and you know, this idea
what
of
I love,
sort of
I like
search
the way
for
you put
stability
that.
come together.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. And I think that, you know, the people in this book who are the ones who realize sort of what's happening and are taking the risks are people like Heisenberg and Schrödinger. And these people, unlike most of us who this is just sort of like happening and we're not aware of it, these people realize we're gonna put a whole new way of looking at the world into place. And yet we're gonna do it anyway. And that's an incredibly courageous, powerful, risky endeavor that these physicists are engaging in. That's why she says these are the actors of the future. They're the ones who are really remaking our world in ways that no one else could today, in ways that, you know, politicians can't.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I know there's one more question. John, I feel badly. I'm really late for an obligation here. I have dinner that I'm supposed to go to. John, do you want to ask your question very quickly?
I'll try. It seems to me she's lamenting the movement of away from contemplation from as man has marched through time, and that it's constantly been towards the to the maker or the homo faber, and it seems like the implication for me is that there is that she thinks we're losing or moving further away from a universal truth.
John, just so you know, I don't think she laments that part at all. You know, I think she's, you know, aware that there were good parts of that and bad parts. I think if there's a part she laments, it's that we're losing human action separate from the action of scientists. I don't think she really laments the universal truth aspect of it. Maybe she does. I don't see that.
Okay. I just wondered, why not just flip it on its head and say, as we've gone through time, through the people, and maybe that's what she means, there's a positive and a negative, that we've been brought closer to the universal truths. She seems, that's my observation, that I think it'd easily be turned on its this whole process, not, and I don't mean it in the context of how she's using it, the whole litany in terms of this march that man has gone through, we are closer to the truths. We've gained understanding through our instruments and internal contemplation, not moved away from it.
Okay, I do have to run, so I'm gonna let you end up with the final word, John. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You should get ready to start reading The Life of the Mind, and we'll figure out a schedule. Thank you all. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and thanks very much.